She's not the woman I paid for. Load her back on the wagon and get her out of my valley." 50 people watched Victor Harlan throw a bride into the dirt, her whole life spilling out of a broken suitcase at his feet, and not one of them moved. Not one. Charlotte Hayes stood alone in front of a crowd that had come to watch her be welcomed, and instead watched her be thrown away. Then a quiet cowboy, nobody respected, stepped forward, picked up her case and said the words that would tear this valley apart. "Subscribe and stay with me to the end, and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far this story travels. She's not the woman I paid for." Victor Harlan said it loud enough for every soul in the valley to hear, and he said it slow, the way a man says a thing he once remembered. Charlotte Hayes stood at the back of the wagon with one gloved hand still resting on the rail. Her boot barely touched down on the ground she'd traveled 2,000 miles to reach. She had rehearsed this moment for weeks. She had practiced her smile in the swaying dark of the train car until her cheeks ached. She had decided she would be gracious and warm and everything a frontier wife ought to be. She had not practiced this. "Mr. Harlan," she began, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I believe there's been some confusion. My letters." "Your letters," Victor repeated, and he laughed. It was not a kind laugh. He turned in his saddle to the crowd he had gathered because he had gathered them. He had ridden through the valley for a week, telling every rancher and shopkeeper and farmhand to come see the fine Eastern lady he'd sent for. Her letters. She wrote me she was the daughter of a respectable family, a Boston family, educated, refined. He spat the words like they'd gone sour in his mouth. "Nobody told me refined meant ruined." Charlotte felt the ground tilt under her. "I don't understand what you—" "I received a telegram 3 days ago," Victor said, and he pulled a folded paper from his coat and held it up like evidence in a courtroom. "From an associate of mine back east. Seems the Hayes family isn't respectable at all anymore. Seems your father died owing half of Boston. Seems you're not a school teacher who chose to come west for adventure. You're a beggar in a good dress running from creditors." The crowd made a sound, then not words, just a low ripple of breath and murmur, the sound of dozens of people leaning in. Charlotte's chin came up. She would remember later that she did not cry. Not then. "My father's debts are my father's. I came here in good faith. Everything I wrote you was true. Everything you left out was the truth that mattered." Victor folded the telegram and tucked it away unhurried, a man who had already won and was only deciding how thoroughly he wished to enjoy it. "I brought half this valley out here today to witness me bring home a bride worth having. I'll not have them witness me marry a pauper. A man's got his standing." "Then you should have written to me privately," Charlotte said, "and spared us both this." Something flickered across Victor's face. Surprise maybe that she'd bitten back. It hardened fast into contempt. "Privately." He said the word like it disgusted him. "You don't teach a lesson in private, ma'am. You want a valley to remember what happens when somebody tries to make a fool of Victor Harlan. You do it where everybody's looking." And then he reached down and he took her suitcase off the wagon. The single case that held everything she owned in the world, everything she hadn't sold to buy her passage, and he dropped it. Not set it down. Dropped it so it hit the dirt and burst its old clasp, and a corner of a folded shawl spilled out into the mud. "There's a stage back to Cheyenne on Thursday," Victor said, gathering his reins. "You'll want to be on it. There's nothing here for you." He rode away. He rode away, and he did not look back, and Charlotte Hayes stood alone in the middle of a crowd of 50 people, none of whom would meet her eyes. She bent down. That was the thing the whole valley would talk about for years afterward. Not that Victor Harlan had thrown a woman out like spoiled meat, but that the woman had bent down calm as Sunday, and gathered her own shawl back into her case, and pressed the broken clasp shut with her thumb, and stood up straight. She did not run. She did not weep. She looked at the faces around her one by one, and she waited to see if a single one of them had a shred of decency in it. None of them did. Old Mrs. Pruitt looked at her shoes. The blacksmith found something fascinating about his own hands. Two women who had 30 seconds earlier been whispering about how pretty the bride was, now whispered about how they'd always known there was something off about her. A boy started to step forward, and his mother caught his collar and hauled him back. "Well?" Charlotte said to no one, to everyone. Her voice did not shake, and she was proud of that later, when she had the room to be proud of anything. "I suppose I've kept you all long enough?" She picked up her case, and she turned toward the road, toward Cheyenne, toward Thursday, toward whatever a woman does when she has spent her last dollar getting to a place that doesn't want her, and she took one step. "Ma'am." She stopped. The voice had come from the edge of the crowd, low and unhurried, and when she turned, she saw a man she hadn't noticed before, which was strange because he was not a small man. He stood a full head above most of the others, 38 or so, with the kind of weathered stillness that comes from years of talking mostly to horses. His hat was in his hand. She realized after a moment that it was the only hat in the whole crowd that had come off. "You drop this," he said. He held out her glove. It had fallen from her wrist when the suitcase burst, and she hadn't noticed, and he'd picked it up out of the dirt, and he'd cleaned it against his sleeve without seeming to think about it, and now he was holding it out to her like it was a thing that mattered. Charlotte looked at the glove. She looked at the man. "Thank you," she said. He didn't leave. He should have. Every other person in that valley had already decided the safest thing to do was pretend she wasn't there, and here was this man just standing, hat in one hand, looking at her like he was working something out. "That's a long walk to Cheyenne," he said. "I'm aware. 40 miles. I'll manage. In them boots, you'll manage about 8 of it." He said it plainly, no cruelty in it, just fact. "And there's no water between here and the crossing till you reach Halloran's, and Halloran won't give a stranger a drink unless she's got coin. And I'm guessing—" He stopped himself. Started again, gentler. "I'm not guessing anything. Beg your pardon?" The nearest knot of townspeople had gone very quiet. They were listening now the way people listen when they smell something about to happen. "You're Ethan Cole," Charlotte said. It surprised him. She could see it. "How's that? Mr. Harlan mentioned you in his letters." She almost smiled, and it was a terrible sort of almost smile, the kind that hurts to hold. He said his neighbor to the north was a man who kept to himself and never amounted to anything. A man who let a good ranch run to nothing because he was too proud or too stupid to marry and get himself some help. He wrote that to me as a comfort, so I'd know how lucky I was to be marrying him instead. Somebody in the crowd laughed a short, startled bark, quickly swallowed. Ethan Cole did not laugh. He turned the hat once in his hands. "Well," he said, "he's got 2 of the 3 right. I do keep to myself." And then he did the thing. He walked past her 3 steps, and he crouched down, and he took her suitcase, took it right out of the space beside her boot where she'd set it, and he stood back up with it, and he said loud enough, plenty loud enough, so that no soul in that valley could ever claim they hadn't heard. "A decent woman shouldn't have to face this frontier alone. My place isn't much. It's not what he's got, and it never will be. But there's a roof, and there's food, and there's a door with a lock on the inside that only you'll hold the key to. You're welcome there until you decide your own future, not mine, not his, yours." For one long moment, nobody in the entire valley made a sound. Then Mrs. Pruitt, who had been studying her shoes, found her voice, and it came out sharp and scandalized. "Ethan Cole, you can't take a strange woman to your ranch. What'll people say?" Ethan looked at her. "They'll say whatever they were already fixing to say, Ms. Pruitt," he answered. "You've all had plenty to say already, and not one word of it was, 'Let me help you, ma'am.' So I don't reckon your opinion of what I do next is worth the breath it'd take to hear it." He turned to Charlotte. His voice dropped private just for her. "You don't have to come," he said. "I want that clear. If you'd rather walk to Cheyenne, I'll drive you there myself right now and not say another word. But if you'll let a stranger show you one kindness on the worst day you've had in a while, I've got a wagon behind the Mercantile and 2 hours of daylight left." Charlotte Hayes looked at this man she had never met, whose neighbor had told her he was worthless, standing in a crowd of decent Christian people who had watched her humiliated and done nothing holding her broken suitcase like it was worth something. "Why?" she asked. It was barely a whisper. "Why would you do this?" "You don't know me." And Ethan Cole was quiet for a moment. When he answered, he wasn't looking at her. He was looking somewhere past her, somewhere years back. "I knew a woman once," he said, "who deserved better than the world gave her. World didn't give her time enough for me to fix it." He put his hat back on. "I don't much care to stand and watch it happen twice." He walked toward the mercantile. He didn't check to see if she was following. That, more than anything, more than the glove, more than the words, more than the way he'd faced down the whole valley, that was the thing that decided her. He didn't check. He didn't need her to follow so he could feel like a hero. He'd have driven her to Cheyenne just the same. He just started walking and left the choosing to her, which was more choosing than anybody had given her in a very long time. Charlotte Hayes followed him. Behind her, the valley erupted into the kind of talk that would keep it fed for a month. The wagon smelled of feed sack and old leather, and for the first 3 miles, neither of them said a word. Charlotte sat with her hands folded in her lap, and her spine straight, and her eyes fixed forward, and she was doing sums. She had done sums her whole life. Her father had taught her, before he lost the sense to teach anything back, when he'd been a man with a ledger and a good name. She was doing sums now. How many days of food she had left, which was none. How much money, which was 70 cents. How far a woman with 70 cents and no name could get before the frontier decided what to do with her. "You'll want to know my terms," she said abruptly. Ethan flicked the reins. "Didn't know I'd offered any. That's why I need to state mine." She turned to face him. "I won't take charity, Mr. Cole. I'll die first, and I mean that plainly, so please don't waste your breath being gentle about it. If I stay under your roof, I stay as a hired woman. I'll cook, I'll clean, I'll keep your books. If you have any, I'll mend, and I'll wash, and I'll do whatever honest labor a ranch needs doing. And you'll pay me a wage, a real wage, the same you'd pay a man to do the same work less what my board is worth. We'll settle the figure tonight and write it down and both sign it. And when I've earned enough to leave, I'll leave, and neither of us will owe the other a thing." Ethan drove in silence for a moment. "That's a lot of conditions," he said, "for a woman who was fixing to walk to Cheyenne an hour ago." "A woman who was fixing to walk to Cheyenne an hour ago," Charlotte said, "has learned exactly what happens when she lets a man be responsible for her. I let a man be responsible for me. I sold my mother's piano, and my books, and my winter coat, and I bought a train ticket on the strength of a man's promise, and that man threw my life into the mud in front of 50 people this afternoon. So you'll forgive me if I'd rather owe you money than gratitude." Ethan turned his head and looked at her, and for the first time she saw something in his face besides that careful stillness. It might have been respect. "Fair enough," he said. "You keep books. I taught arithmetic for 6 years. I can keep books in my sleep. Then I'll tell you the truth since we're writing things down." He faced the road again. "My books are a disgrace. I've got money coming in and money going out, and no earthly idea which is winning. Been meaning to sort it for 2 years. Never do. If you can make sense of it, that alone's worth your wage." It's settled then. It's settled. They rode another mile. "Mr. Cole?" "Ethan's fine. Mr. Cole was my father, and he was a harder man than me." "Ethan." She said it carefully like a word in a foreign language. "What you said back there. About a woman. Who deserved better." His jaw tightened. She saw it, the small clench of it, and she almost let it drop. But she had spent an afternoon being lied about, and she found she had no patience left for the comfortable silences people used to hide behind. "You don't have to tell me," she said. "But if I'm going to live in your house, I'd rather not spend my nights inventing reasons a good man would take in a stranger. Give me the true reason, and I'll leave it be forever after." Ethan Cole was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. "Her name was Sarah," he said finally. "We were to be married, spring of '84. What happened? There was a stampede." His voice went flat the way a man's voice goes when he's carried a thing so long it's worn smooth. "Cattle drive late in the season. Shouldn't have been running that late, but there was money in it if we pushed. My brother James was on that drive, 22 years old, and Sarah—" He stopped, cleared his throat. "Sarah had come out to bring us a hot meal on account of it being James's birthday. She wasn't even supposed to be near the herd. Something spooked them in the night. 2,000 head. By the time it was over, James was gone and Sarah was gone, and I was the one who found them both. Charlotte's hand had risen to her mouth without her deciding it should. "I'm so sorry," she said. "You asked." "I did." She lowered her hand. "Something spooked them, you said." "What?" And there it was, the smallest hitch. The kind of pause a person makes when the true answer and the safe answer are standing in the same doorway, and only one can come out. "Never proved anything," Ethan said. "That's not what I asked." He looked at her again longer this time. "You're a sharp one," he said. "That's going to make you a lot of trouble out here." "It already has." "What spooked the cattle, Ethan?" He faced the road. The muscle in his jaw worked once. "Somebody fired shots into the herd at midnight," he said. 2 shots, maybe 3. Man riding drag heard them. Said they came from the East Ridge, and there was only one spread east of that ridge, with men who'd have had a reason. He drew a slow breath. There was a boundary dispute that year. Water rights. My father was set to win it in the territorial court that fall. He'd have won it too. Then James died and Sarah died, and my father lost his mind to grief inside of 6 months, and there was nobody left to press the case, so the water went to the other spread by default. A long pause. Man who took that water built the biggest ranch in this valley off the back of it. Runs it to this day. Charlotte felt something go very cold and very still inside her. "Ethan," she said carefully, "the spread east of that ridge, the one that won the water." He didn't answer. "Whose is it?" Ethan Cole flicked the reins and the wagon rolled on toward a ranch she hadn't seen yet, and he said the name so quietly she almost missed it under the creak of the wheels. "Harlan's," he said. "It's Victor Harlan's." Charlotte did not speak again for a long while. She was recalculating everything. Every letter Victor had sent her, every boast about the size of his herd and the reach of his land, every casual line about the neighbor to the north who'd let his family's ranch run to nothing. She was turning all of it over now, in the cold new light of what Ethan had told her, and the picture that came together made her stomach turn. "He knew," she said finally. "When you took me in today, when you crouched down and picked up my case in front of everyone, you knew whose bride you were carrying off. You knew exactly whose face you were going to be rubbing it in." "I did. And that's why you did it." She wasn't accusing him. She was just understanding. "Not because of me at all. Because of him. Because for once you had a chance to take something of Victor Harlan's and walk off with it in front of the whole valley." Ethan pulled the wagon to a stop. He didn't do it angry. That was what unsettled her most. He simply drew the horses up on the empty road and turned in the seat and looked at her with those level gray eyes, and she braced herself for the anger a man usually shows when a woman sees through him. It didn't come. "You want the honest answer," he said, "or the one that'll let you feel better about getting in this wagon?" "The honest one. I've had a belly full of the other kind today." "All right." He rested his forearms on his knees. "When I saw Victor Harlan throw your case in the dirt, the first thing I felt God's truth was glad. I ain't proud of it. But I stood there, and I thought, there it is. There's the whole man laid bare in front of everybody, and now they'll all see what I've known for 4 years. And yes, for about 10 seconds, some ugly part of me wanted to walk over and pick up his bride just to watch his face." Charlotte's mouth had gone tight. "But then you turned around," Ethan went on. "You bent down and got your own shawl out of the mud calm as anything, and you looked at every one of those cowards straight in the eye. And you said, 'I suppose I've kept you all long enough,' and you started walking. 40 miles, in them boots. With 70 cents, I'd have bet my ranch you didn't have much more than." His voice roughened. "And that's when it stopped being about him. Somewhere in there, ma'am, it stopped being about Victor Harlan, and it started being about the fact that I couldn't stand there one more second and watch a person carry that much and not offer to carry some of it. That's the honest answer. It started ugly. It didn't stay ugly. That's the best I can give you." The road was quiet. Somewhere a meadowlark ran its little ladder of notes up and down. Well, Charlotte said, and her voice was not quite steady now for the first time all day. That's the most honest thing anyone said to me since I got off that train. It's the most honest thing I've said to anybody in 4 years. Then we're even. She faced forward, pressed her hands flat on her knees to still them. Drive on, Ethan. I'd like to see this ranch that isn't much. He clicked to the horses. They rolled on. But Charlotte's mind would not go quiet. Because there was a piece that didn't fit, and she had spent her whole life unable to leave a piece that didn't fit. Ethan, she said, may I ask you something that isn't kind? Seems to be the day for it. Victor Harlan wrote to a matchmaking agency in Boston for a bride. A man with the biggest ranch in the Valley land. Cattle standing, he could have married any rancher's daughter in the territory. Why send 2,000 miles for a stranger? Ethan's hands went still on the reins. She watched him think about it. She watched the answer arrive, and she watched him not like it. I don't know, he said slowly. I never thought to wonder, but now you say it. He frowned. There's a Dawson girl over in the next county been trying to catch Victor 2 years. Good family. Good land that shares a fence with his. Marrying her would have doubled his holdings. Any man with sense would have married the Dawson girl. Unless, Charlotte said quietly, he needed a wife nobody in this valley knew. A wife with no family close by to ask questions. A wife who came from 2,000 miles away and knew no one and would depend on him entirely. She stared at the road ahead. I thought this afternoon was the cruelest thing that had ever happened to me, Ethan. But sitting here, I'm starting to wonder if it was the luckiest. Because a man who plans that carefully doesn't send for a lonely stranger without a reason. And I don't think the reason was love. Ethan Cole looked at her. Really looked the kind of look a man gives when he's just realized the person beside him is a good deal more dangerous and a good deal more valuable than he first understood. You think he wanted something from you, he said. I think, Charlotte said, that Victor Harlan doesn't do anything in front of 50 people unless he's already gotten what he wanted in private. And I'd very much like to know what that was. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The wagon crested a low rise, and Ethan drew the horses up and pointed with his chin. That's it, he said. Home. Charlotte looked, and she felt something catch in her chest that she hadn't expected to feel. Not at the ranch, which was small and plain and honest exactly as he'd promised, but at the word. Home. She'd crossed a continent chasing it. It had thrown her in the dirt. And now here it was offered plain by a stranger, with grief in his eyes. And she didn't dare trust it, and she wanted it so badly, her throat ached. It isn't much, Ethan said again. You keep saying that. Wanted to be sure you heard it. I heard it. Charlotte lifted her chin. Take me down, Mr. Cole. I've got books to look at, and it appears I've got a wage to earn. The 2 ranch hands who came out to meet the wagon were named Toby and Old Pete, and they stopped dead in the yard when they saw the woman on the seat. Toby was maybe 19, all elbows and Adam's apple, and his mouth actually fell open. Old Pete was somewhere north of 60, with a face like a dropped saddle, and he didn't open his mouth at all. He just looked at Charlotte, and then he looked at Ethan, and then he took his hat off. Slow. And Charlotte understood that in his own quiet way, Old Pete had just decided something. Boys, Ethan said, swinging down. This is Miss Charlotte Hayes. She's going to be working here, keeping the books, running the house. You'll treat her the way you'd treat your own mother, or you'll answer to me, and I'll be short about it. That understood. Yes, sir, Toby squeaked. Old Pete just nodded, hat still in his hands. Miss Hayes, Ethan said, coming around to help her down. This is Toby. He's a good hand and a worse cook, which is a problem we've all suffered under for 2 years. And this is Pete. Pete doesn't say much. Ma'am, said Pete. Mr. Pete. Charlotte answered and took Ethan's hand and stepped down onto her new ground. She had not gone 3 steps toward the house when Toby, who had clearly been unable to contain himself 1 second longer, burst out. Is it true what they're already saying in town, that Mr. Harlan's mail-order bride got throwed out and Ethan up and took her? The yard went very still. Ethan turned. But before he could open his mouth, Charlotte spoke, and her voice was clear and calm and carried all the way across the yard. "It's true," she said. "Victor Harlan sent for me from Boston, and he humiliated me in front of the whole valley this afternoon, and he threw everything I own into the dirt, and Mr. Cole was the only person there decent enough to lend me a hand. So yes, that's what happened, and I imagine you'll hear it 100 ways before Sunday, and most of them will be crueler than the truth. So I'd rather you have the truth from me now, and be done wondering." Toby's ears went scarlet. I didn't mean nothing by it, ma'am. I know you didn't," Charlotte said gentler. "You're young. When you're young, you say the loud thing before you say the kind thing. You'll grow out of it or you won't, and I hope you do." She turned toward the house. "Now, someone show me these books before I lose my nerve about the whole arrangement." Old Pete watched her go. Then he sidled up close to Ethan, and in a voice like gravel rolling downhill, he said the most words Toby had ever heard him string together at once. "Boss," Pete said, "you know Harlan ain't gonna let this lie." Ethan watched Charlotte reach the porch square, her shoulders, and push open his front door like she'd lived there her whole life. "No," Ethan said. "I don't reckon he is. He's a bad man to have wanting something you've got. I know it. And now you've got two things he wants." Pete jerked his chin toward the house, the woman, and the satisfaction of taking her back. Ethan was quiet. "I didn't take her, Pete," he said. "You don't take a person. That's the whole difference between him and me, and if you can't see it, you've been listening to him too long." Old Pete considered that. Then he nodded slow and put his hat back on. "All the same," he said, "I'd sleep with the rifle handy a while." Inside, Charlotte found the ledger exactly where Ethan said it would be, shoved in a drawer under a pile of unpaid feed bills and a broken spur, and she carried it to the table and opened it and began, without asking permission, to read. It took her about 20 minutes to understand 3 things. The first was that Ethan Cole was not a poor manager. He was a poor bookkeeper, which was a different thing entirely. The money was there. The ranch was sound. He simply had no system, and so he lived in a permanent fog of not knowing whether he was winning, and a man who doesn't know whether he's winning makes small, frightened choices. And small, frightened choices had cost him more over 2 years than any drought would have. The second thing she understood was that she could fix it, easily. She could turn this fog into a clear picture inside of a month, and once he could see the picture, this ranch would stop merely surviving and start to grow. Something warm and fierce woke up in her chest at that, the old teacher's joy of a problem that could actually be solved. And the third thing she understood, she almost missed. It was a line at the very back of the ledger in Ethan's blunt pencil from 18 months back. Just a note to himself. It read, H. Offered to buy North 40 again. Said no. He'll ask again. Charlotte went still. She turned the page. And the next. And there they were, scattered through the accounts like a thread of poison, little notes months apart in that same blunt hand. H raised his offer. H sent sheriff to talk about back taxes I don't owe. H bought the Miller place east of me, now surrounded on 2 sides. She sat with the ledger open, and she understood something that made her blood run cold, and she understood it a full day before Ethan Cole would let himself say it out loud. Victor Harlan wasn't just a proud man who'd humiliated a woman. Victor Harlan was a man buying up an entire valley, one desperate neighbor at a time. And Ethan Cole's ranch, the small, plain, honest ranch that wasn't much the one whose North 40 butted right against Harlan, land the one standing square in the path of everything Victor wanted to become, was the last piece he didn't own. She heard Ethan's boots on the porch. She closed the ledger. She wasn't ready to say it yet. She needed to be sure, and she needed to think, and she needed God help her after the day she'd had to sleep one night under a roof before she picked up another war. Ethan came in ducking under the low frame and stopped when he saw her face. "You've been in those books 10 minutes, he said, "and you already look like somebody died." "No," Charlotte said. She stood and smoothed her skirt and made her voice ordinary. "Nobody's died. Your accounts are a mess, but they're an honest mess, and I can put them right. That's all." It was not all. He knew it was not all. She could see him knowing it. But he was a man who understood better than most that a person is allowed to keep a thing until they're ready to set it down. So he only nodded. "There's a room off of the kitchen," he said. "Was my mother's. It's got a good bed and a stove and a door that bolts from the inside. It's yours long as you want it. I'll take the barn tonight and every night, and don't you argue, because I'd sleep out there anyhow before I'd have this valley say one wrong word about you that had any truth in it." Charlotte looked at this man. She had crossed a continent to marry a stranger who threw her in the dirt, and she had ended the same day in the house of a different stranger who was giving up his own bed so that no one could ever say a word against her. "Thank you, Ethan," she said. And this time, when she said it, there was no wall behind the words. Just the plain, worn gratitude of a woman who had run out of every other thing to hold on to. "Get some sleep, Miss Hayes." "Charlotte." He paused at the door. "Charlotte. Good night." He went out to the barn. She heard him talking low to the horses the way she'd guessed he did, and Charlotte Hayes sat back down at the table, and she opened the ledger one more time, and she looked at that thread of poison running through the pages, and she made herself a promise in the dark. She had come west to be somebody's wife. That was over. That man had shown her exactly what he was, but she was not going to be run off. Not by Victor Harlan, not by 50 silent cowards in a valley, not by 70 cents and a broken suitcase. She had found in the space of a single afternoon the last honest man for 40 miles and the first roof that had ever felt like it might hold. And a man was circling both of them, like a wolf circles a lamed calf, and that man did not know, did not have the first idea that the beggar in a good dress he'd thrown in the dirt that afternoon could read a ledger like scripture. He would find out. Charlotte closed the book and blew out the lamp, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she was not afraid of tomorrow. She was ready for it. Charlotte woke before dawn, and for one long, disorienting moment, she did not know where she was, and then she remembered, and the remembering came with a strange calm. She had a room. She had a door that bolted. She had a ledger full of a rich man's poison, and she had a plan for it, or at least the beginning of one. She dressed and went to the kitchen and found she was not the first one up. Ethan was already at the stove doing violence to a pan of eggs. "You cook," she said. "I burn," he corrected. "There's a difference, and Toby'll swear to it in court." "Give me the pan." "You're a hired woman, not a slave. You don't have to cook my breakfast the first morning." "I'm not cooking your breakfast." She took the pan out of his hand anyway. "I'm saving 3 good eggs from a man who clearly doesn't deserve them. Sit down, Ethan. Watch how it's done, and maybe by spring you won't poison your own hands." He sat. He watched. And something in the set of his shoulders eased just slightly, the way a man eases when he has spent 2 years holding up a house alone, and someone has finally quietly taken hold of one corner. That was the first small thing. There would be a great many small things, and Charlotte would come to understand over the weeks that followed that a home is not built by grand gestures. It is built by 3 eggs cooked properly, and a lamp trimmed so it doesn't smoke, and a ledger balanced so a man can sleep. It is built out of 10,000 small things done well by someone who has decided to stay. She had not decided to stay. She told herself that firmly every morning as she pinned up her hair. She was a hired woman earning a wage until she had enough to build a life on her own terms. That was all. She told herself that for a good long while before she stopped believing it. The work itself she attacked like a general. Within 3 days, she had the ledger transcribed into a system that made sense columns and headings and running balances, and on the 4th morning, she set it in front of Ethan at breakfast and put her finger on a number. "That," she said, "is what you're worth. On paper, today." Ethan looked at the number. He was quiet for a moment. "That can't be right." "It's right. I've checked it twice. I've been telling myself for 2 years I was one bad winter from losing everything." "You've been telling yourself that," Charlotte said, "because you couldn't see. A man who can't see the ground in front of him walks like it's a cliff even when it's flat. You're not one bad winter from losing everything, Ethan. You're one good year from being able to look Victor Harlan in the eye as an equal. You just never had anybody hold up the lamp." He stared at the number a while longer. Then he stared at her. "Who taught you this?" "My father." A shadow crossed her face. "Back when he had a name worth keeping. He taught me numbers before he taught me needlework," said a woman who can read a ledger can never be lied to about money, and money is the lie men tell women most often. She closed the book. He was right about that. He just forgot his own lesson at the end and let another man keep his books, and that man ruined him. So no, I don't take charity, and I don't let anyone else keep my numbers. Ever. Ethan nodded slowly, and then he said the thing she hadn't expected. "You've been in that ledger 4 days," he said, "and you haven't once mentioned the notes." Charlotte went still. "You saw them," Ethan went on. "First night. I watched your face when you came out of that book, and you looked like you'd seen a ghost, and you told me nobody died. So you've known for 4 days what Harlan's been doing to me, and you've been sitting on it, and I want to know why." There it was. She'd hoped for more time. She should have known better than to hope with a man this quiet, because quiet men see everything. "Because I wanted to be sure," Charlotte said. "And because I wanted to understand it before I said it, so that when I said it, I'd have something to offer besides fear." She opened the ledger again to the back to the poisoned pages. "Sit down, Ethan. You should have made me say this 3 days ago." She laid it out for him the way she'd have laid out a proof for a slow class patiently, in order letting each fact rest on the one before it. The offers to buy his North 40 rising each time he refused. The sheriff sent about back taxes he didn't owe. The purchase of the Miller place to the east, and then she showed him this. She'd found it in a bill of sale tucked in the ledger's back cover, the purchase of the Sorensen place to the south 6 months back, which Ethan hadn't even fully registered because he'd been too deep in his own fog to notice. "You're surrounded on 3 sides now," she said. "Harlan land to the east, to the south, and the old Miller water to the north of the ridge. The only open ground you've got left is west toward the Badlands where nothing grows and no wagon can cross. He hasn't been trying to buy your ranch, Ethan. He's been building a fence around it, a fence made of land." Ethan sat very still. "Why?" he said. "Why work so hard for one small spread when he's got the biggest ranch in the valley?" "That," Charlotte said, "is the question I've been asking myself for 4 days. And I think I finally have the shape of an answer, though I can't prove it yet." She leaned forward. "What runs through your North 40, Ethan?" "The piece he keeps trying to buy." "Creek." "The creek. And where does that creek go?" Ethan's brow furrowed. "Runs down through my land, then south. Feeds the low pasture, then keeps on." He stopped. She watched the understanding hit him like cold water. "Keeps on into Sorensen's old place, the one he just bought. And before it reaches you," Charlotte said quietly, "where does it come from?" "The ridge. The East Ridge water." His voice had gone flat. "The water my father was set to win in court. The water Victor took after James and Sarah died." "So Victor Harlan controls the water at the top of that creek," Charlotte said, "and he now owns the land at the bottom of it. And the only thing standing in between the only stretch of that creek he doesn't control is your North 40. He doesn't want your ranch, Ethan. He wants your water. He wants to own that creek from the ridge to the valley floor, every drop of it, so that every rancher downstream of him has to come to Victor Harlan, hat in hand, and pay for water God gave away for free. And your 40 acres is the one link in that chain he can't buy." She sat back. "That's not a proud man who threw a woman in the dirt. That's a man building a kingdom, and you're the last free acre in it." The kitchen was silent for a long moment. "You worked all that out," Ethan said slowly, "from my chicken scratch notes and a couple of bills of sale. I worked it out because my father was ruined by exactly this kind of man, and I've had years to learn how they think." She met his eyes. "A man like Victor doesn't take what he wants all at once. He takes it a slice at a time from people too proud or too tired or too alone to see the whole knife. My father was proud and tired and alone. And I watched." Her voice hardened. I'm not going to watch it happen again. Not to you. And there it was, the second small thing that was not small at all. Not to you. She heard herself say it, and she saw him hear it, and neither of them remarked on it. But the room was different after. She had said you like it was hers to protect. Like his ranch was a thing she'd decided to stand in front of. She changed the subject fast before either of them could sit in it too long. But I could be wrong, she said briskly. It's a theory, not a proof. And a theory won't hold up against a man with the sheriff in his pocket. So we're going to do this the way my father should have done it. Quietly. We're going to make your ranch so strong, so obviously sound, that when Harlan comes, and he'll come Ethan sooner now that you've embarrassed him in front of the valley, he finds a man he can't frighten and can't starve and can't fool. We build the walls first, then we worry about the wolf. And how do we build walls? Charlotte smiled, and it was the first real smile he'd seen from her, and it changed her whole face. With Winter, she said, you've got 4 ranch hands who can't read a contract, a house running at half its worth, and a valley full of neighbors who all just watched you do the only decent thing anybody's done in that town for a year. Winter's coming. Nobody can drive cattle or fight lawsuits in the snow. So we're going to spend the winter turning your ranch into a fortress and turning this valley into a place where people owe you kindness instead of Victor Harlan owing them money. By spring, you won't be the last free acre. You'll be the center of something he can't buy. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. You're a dangerous woman, Charlotte Hayes. I've been told. Now eat your eggs. We've got work. The winter that followed was, though neither of them would have said it aloud, the happiest either of them had known in years. Charlotte did not sit still. It was not in her. Within a week she had discovered that Toby, for all his 19-year-old foolishness, could not read, not past his own name, and the labels on feed sacks, and that this shamed him so deeply he'd rather burn a contract than admit he couldn't make out its words. She discovered old Pete could read fine, but hadn't held a book in 40 years, and missed it more than he'd ever have confessed. She discovered that 2 of the drifting hands who wintered on the ranchmen named Cortez and Bill had between them exactly enough letters to sign for their wages, and no more. So she started a school. She did not ask permission. She simply announced at supper one evening that the long table in the main room would be a schoolroom for 1 hour every night after the meal, and that any man who wished to learn to read and cipher was welcome, and any man who did not was welcome to go on being cheated by every clerk and creditor he'd ever meet. There was a silence. I ain't sitting at no school table like a child, said Bill, who was 40 and mean about it. Then don't, Charlotte said pleasantly. But when Harlan's lawyer slides a paper across a table and tells you it says one thing, when it says another, you'll wish you had. My father lost everything he owned to a paper he trusted a man to read to him. You do as you like, Bill. I'm only offering. Bill grumbled. Bill left the table. And Bill was back the next night, sitting at the far end with his arms crossed and his ears open, and within a month he was the fiercest student she had, because a mean man who learns to read discovers he's been lied to his whole life, and there is no student like a man who's just gotten angry. Ethan watched all of this from the doorway most nights, saying nothing. He watched Toby's face the night the boy read a full sentence aloud without stumbling, and the way the boy looked up stunned, like a man who'd just been told he could fly. He watched old Pete move his lips over a page of scripture he hadn't been able to read since his own mother died. He watched Charlotte lean over Cortez's shoulder and correct his letters with the endless, unhurried patience of a woman who believed all the way down that every person in that room was worth the trouble. And he understood, watching her, that he had not taken in a hired woman at all. He had taken in a force. You're doing it again, Charlotte said one night after the men had shuffled off to their bunks and she was banking the fire. Doing what? Standing in doorways, watching. You do it every night. You never sit down at the table. Ethan was quiet. Sarah used to read to the children, he said finally. At the church before she used to gather up all the little ones on distant ranches, the ones whose folks couldn't get them to a schoolhouse, and she'd read to them Sunday afternoons. Wanted to be a teacher, never got the chance. He looked at the long table, the guttering candles, the slate Charlotte had propped against the wall. Standing here watching you, it's like... He stopped. His jaw worked. It's like watching a thing that should have happened happen anyhow. 10 years too late and to the wrong woman, but happening. And I don't know what to do with that. Charlotte set down the poker. "Ethan," she said gently, "I'm not her. I won't ever be her, and I wouldn't try. And you shouldn't want me to. I know that. But I think..." She chose her words carefully because they mattered. "I think the thing Sarah wanted to build and didn't get to was never really about her. It was about the children on the distant ranches who deserve to read. Those children are still out there, Ethan. They still can't get to a schoolhouse. And the grief you've been carrying for 10 years won't teach a single one of them their letters." She let that settle. "You want to honor her? Let me start a real school. Sundays. For the children on the far ranches like she wanted. Not to replace her. To finish what she started. Because somebody should. And it may as well be the two saddest people in this valley." Ethan looked at her for a long, long moment. "You'd do that," he said. "You'd take the thing that broke my heart and turn it into a schoolhouse." "I'd take the thing that broke your heart," Charlotte said, "and turn it into a reason to get up in the morning. For both of us. God knows we could use one." And that Sunday and every Sunday after the children came. They came from ranches 10 and 15 miles out, riding double behind their fathers, small and shy and wide-eyed, and Charlotte set them at the long table and taught them their letters, and their parents, who had every one of them stood silent in that valley, the day Victor Harlan threw her in the dirt. Their parents stood in Ethan Cole's yard and did not quite know where to look, because here was the woman they'd watched be humiliated, and she was teaching their children to read for nothing, asking not 1 cent, and they had done nothing for her, and shame is a powerful thing. Old Widow Garrett was the first to break. She came the third Sunday with a basket of preserves and pressed it into Charlotte's hands, and would not meet her eyes. "I stood there that day," the old woman said, low and shaking. "I stood there, and I watched what that man did to you, and I never said a word. And I've hated myself for it every day since. I'm too old to be a coward, and I was a coward anyway. I don't expect you to forgive it." Charlotte took the basket, and then she took the old woman's hands. "Mrs. Garrett," she said, "the day I arrived, 50 people watched me be humiliated, and 1 man helped me. And now you've come here with preserves and an honest apology, which makes 2. If everyone in this valley who watched came and did one honest thing, we'd have 50. So no, I don't hold that day against you. I'd rather see what you do with the next one." The old woman wept, and she came back the next Sunday, and the one after, and she brought 2 more families with her. And this was how it began. The slow turning of a whole valley, one ashamed neighbor at a time, from a place that had watched Charlotte Hayes fall, to a place that would, when the time came, stand up for her. Charlotte didn't plan it as strategy exactly. She'd have taught those children if not one adult had ever thanked her. But Ethan saw the strategy in it, even when she didn't, and one evening he said so. "You're building your walls," he said. "The ones you talked about. Only they're not made of fence. They're made of people. Every family that owes you a kindness is a family that won't side with Harlan when he comes." "I'm teaching children to read," Charlotte said. "You're doing both," Ethan said. "That's what I keep trying to tell you. You don't do one thing at a time. You never have." He shook his head half in wonder. "Victor thinks he beat you. He thinks he threw a beggar in the dirt and won. And all the while the beggar's out here quietly making herself the most loved woman in the valley, and the most dangerous at the same time, and he doesn't even know it's happening. And here the winter turned, and here came the thing that would change everything." Though it came so quietly that neither of them recognized it at first for the twist it was. It was a Sunday in the deep of winter, and one of the children who came to school was a solemn little boy named Samuel, 7 years old. The son of a man named Croft, who worked Charlotte, had not realized this at first as a hand on Victor Harlan's ranch. Samuel was a bright boy, but a haunted one. Quiet in a way children shouldn't be, and Charlotte had a gift for haunted quiet, having been a haunted quiet child herself. so she was patient with him. And one afternoon, while the other children practiced their letters, little Samuel sat by the fire, and in the way of children who have been holding a heavy thing too long, began to talk. "My pa's scared," he said. Charlotte kept her voice easy. "Everybody's scared of something, Samuel. What's your pa scared of?" "Mr. Harlan." The boy stared into the fire. "My pa did something for Mr. Harlan a long time ago, back before I was born. Something bad. And now Mr. Harlan says if my pa ever tries to leave or ever tells, he'll—" The boy stopped. His lip trembled. "He'll tell the sheriff my pa done a thing with a gun, at night, and they'll hang him." Charlotte's hands had gone very still on the slate she was holding. "Samuel," she said, and she kept every ounce of the sudden roaring in her blood out of her voice. "Did your pa tell you this?" "No, ma'am. I heard him tell my ma, in the night, when they thought I was asleep." The boy looked up at her, and his eyes were far too old for 7. "My pa cries sometimes, in the barn. A grown man ain't supposed to cry, but my pa does, and I think it's about the thing with the gun. What kind of thing with a gun makes a grown man cry for 10 years? Miss Charlotte?" Charlotte set down the slate very carefully. She thought about a stampede in the spring of 1884. She thought about 2 shots, maybe 3, fired into a herd at midnight from the East Ridge. She thought about a young man named James, and a young woman named Sarah, and a father who lost his mind to grief, and a water dispute that went to Victor Harlan by default. She thought about a ranch hand named Croft, who had done something bad with a gun at night a long time ago, and cried about it for 10 years, and could never leave and never tell. "Samuel," she said, and her voice was as gentle as she had ever made it. "I want you to listen to me, and I want you to remember this even after you've forgotten this whole afternoon. Your pa is a good man. Do you hear me? A man who cries for 10 years over a thing he did is a man with a conscience. And a man with a conscience is a good man who did a bad thing, which is different, so different from a bad man. Your pa's not bad. Your pa's trapped. And there's a difference. And someday I hope somebody sets him free of it. Now go practice your letters, and don't tell anyone you told me this. It'll be our secret, yours and mine. All right." The boy nodded and went back to the table lighter, somehow the way a child is always lighter after he sets down a stone he was never meant to carry. And Charlotte Hayes sat by the fire with her heart pounding, fit to break her ribs. She had it. She had the whole of it. Not proof, not yet. Not the kind a court would hang a man on, but the shape of the truth, complete and terrible. Victor Harlan had not simply won that water dispute by luck when James and Sarah died. He had caused it. He'd sent a man Croft, or someone like Croft, to fire shots into that herd at midnight, to spook 2,000 head into a stampede, meaning perhaps only to scare, only to slow the drive, only to make the Coles miss the market and weaken before the court date. And instead, he'd killed Ethan's brother and Ethan's bride, and won the water anyway, and he'd been holding the man who did it in a cage of blackmail for 10 years to keep it buried. That was the man who'd sent to Boston for a bride nobody would come asking after. That was the man who was building a fence of land around the last honest ranch in the valley. And now Charlotte Hayes knew. She did not tell Ethan that night. She wanted to God how she wanted to, but she made herself wait, because she understood what it would do to him. To learn after 10 years that the accident that took his brother and his bride was no accident. That it was murder. That the man who'd done it had spent a decade lording over the valley 20 miles away, growing fat on the water James and Sarah had died beside. It would not make Ethan careful. It would make him wild. And a wild man walks straight into a rich man's trap with his fists up and gets himself hanged for it. So she held it. She held it the way she'd held the ledger those first 4 days, waiting until she had something to offer besides fire. But holding it changed her, and Ethan felt the change. "Something's different with you," he said a few nights later. They were at the table, the men long abed the fire low. "Ever since Sunday. You've gone somewhere I can't follow, and you keep coming back with your face all locked up. What is it?" "Nothing. Charlotte." He said her name plainly. You told me my books were an honest mess and made me say the hard thing out loud. You don't get to tell me nothing. Not after that." She looked at him, and she wanted more than she had wanted anything in a long time to tell him. Not just the fact of it, the whole of it. She wanted to lay her head down and hand him the weight of what she knew, and let another person carry a corner of it the way he'd let her carry a corner of his ranch. That want frightened her more than Victor Harlan did. "Ethan," she said instead. And she surprised herself with the truth that came out, because it was a different truth than the one she was hiding, but it was true all the same. "When I got off that train, I had one plan. Earn a wage, save it, and leave. Go somewhere no one knew my father's name. Start over as nobody. And every morning I've been here, I've told myself that's still the plan." She looked at her hands. "But it's not. It stopped being the plan, and I don't know exactly when. And that scares me witless, because the last time I trusted a place enough to stay, it threw me in the dirt." Ethan was very still. "I'm not going to throw you in the dirt, Charlotte." "I know you're not. That's what scares me." She laughed a small broken sound. "Victor Harlan, I understood. A cruel man is simple. You know what he'll do. He'll do the cruel thing. But a kind man—" her voice caught. "A kind man could take everything, Ethan, because you'd give it to him gladly. I gave everything I had to a man's promise once, and I swore I never would again. And here I am, 4 months later, wanting to." The fire popped. Neither of them moved. "So don't give it to a promise," Ethan said, finally low. "I'm not asking you for a promise. I never once asked you to stay. I set you up a room with a bolt on the door, and I told you the money was yours and the leaving was yours, and I meant every word, and I mean it still. If you want to go in spring, I'll drive you to the train, and I won't say a word to stop you." He leaned forward, and his gray eyes held hers. "But I'll tell you the same thing you told me about my ledger. You can't see the ground in front of you right now, so you're walking like it's a cliff. It's not a cliff, Charlotte. I'm not a promise in a letter. I'm a man who cooks eggs badly and stands in doorways and has watched you every night for 4 months turn the saddest house in Wyoming into a place with children laughing in it. That's not a promise. That's just what's true. And you don't have to trust a promise to trust what's true." Charlotte's eyes were wet, and she let them be because she was too tired to hide it. "You're better with words than a man who talks mostly to horses has any right to be," she said. "Been saving them up. 10 years worth. Reckon you're the first person worth spending them on." And that was very nearly the moment. They both felt it, the moment where a word would have been said that couldn't be unsaid, where 4 months of small things would have finally added up to one large one. But Charlotte was carrying a murder in her chest, and she could not let the moment finish while she was hiding a thing that big from a man who deserved the whole truth. It would have been a lie built into the foundation, and she knew too well what a foundation built on a hidden thing does to a house. So she pulled back, gently. And Ethan, who understood better than most that a person may keep a thing until they're ready to set it down, let her. "Good night, Ethan," she said, and her voice was thick. "Good night, Charlotte." She went to her room. She bolted the door out of habit, though she'd stopped being afraid of anything on the other side of it weeks ago. And she sat on the edge of her mother's old bed, and she made herself a new plan, because the old one, earned save leave, was dead, and she knew it, and there was no use pretending over its corpse. She would find the proof, whatever it took. She would find a way to reach Croft, the trapped man, the man who cried in the barn, and she would offer him what no one had offered him in 10 years, a way out that didn't end in a rope. And she would build the case slow and quiet and airtight the way her father should have built his, and she would not tell Ethan until she could hand him not just the terrible truth, but the means to see it answered in a court of law. Because she had learned something this winter, watching a man stand in doorways. She had learned that you don't save a person by charging in with your fists up. You save them by holding up the lamp until they can see the ground in front of them. Ethan had held it up for her. Now she'd hold it up for him, and for a trapped ranch hand, and for the ghosts of a brother and a bride who died in the dark 10 years ago, beside water a rich man stole. She would need help. She couldn't do it alone. And the very next morning help arrived, though not in any form she'd have chosen, and not with any warning at all. It came as the sound of horses in the yard, more than one at an hour too early for neighbors and too cold for casual visits. Charlotte was at the stove. She heard Ethan's boots cross the main room, fast heard him lift the rifle from its pegs by the door, and her stomach dropped clean through the floor. "Stay inside," Ethan said low. She did not stay inside. She was never going to be a woman who stayed inside, and he should have known it. She wiped her hands and followed him out onto the porch, and she stood at his shoulder, and she looked out at the three riders who had come up the frozen road in the gray light. The man in front she did not know. A lean man in a good coat with a leather case across his saddle, the kind of case lawyers carry. The second man wore a badge, and she recognized him from town. The sheriff, the one Ethan's notes said, was in Victor's pocket. And the third man sitting his horse a little apart from the others, his face gray with cold, and something worse than cold. His eyes fixed on the porch with an expression Charlotte would spend a long time trying to name. The third man was Victor Harlan. He had not set foot on Ethan Cole's land in 10 years. He had sent offers and sheriffs and lawyers, but he had never once come himself. He had come now. Charlotte felt Ethan go rigid beside her, felt the rifle come up an inch, and she put one hand flat against his forearm, light as a leaf, and she said one word very quietly meant for him alone. "Wait." And Victor Harlan looked up at the woman he had thrown in the dirt 4 months ago. The woman standing now on his enemy's porch, warm and fed and unbroken and utterly unafraid. And something crossed his face that was not anger and was not pride. It was fear. For one instant before he hit it, Victor Harlan looked at Charlotte Hayes like a man looking at the one thing in the world he had not planned for. Then the lawyer cleared his throat and unbuckled his leather case, and drew out a folded paper thick with seals, and Victor's voice rang out across the frozen yard, flat and cold and certain. "Mr. Cole, Miss Hayes." He let the names hang. "I've come to collect what's mine, and I've brought the law to see it done. I've brought the law to see it done." The words hung in the frozen air, and for a moment, nobody moved. Charlotte kept her hand on Ethan's forearm, light, steadying, and she felt the fine tremor of rage running through him, and willed her own calm into him through her fingertips. "What exactly is it you think is yours, Mr. Harlan?" Charlotte asked. Her voice carried clear across the yard, and it did not shake. "Because I've been on this ranch 4 months, and I haven't seen one thing on it with your name." Victor's jaw tightened. He'd expected to speak to Ethan. He had not planned on the woman answering for the house. "You," he said flatly. "You came to this territory under a marriage agreement. My marriage agreement. You traveled here at my expense." "You never paid a cent of my passage," Charlotte cut in. "I sold my mother's piano. I have the bill of sale. Would you like to see it?" "Under my agreement." Victor pressed on louder. "Which makes you my responsibility and my charge under the law, and I'll not have it said in this valley that Victor Harlan let a woman who came west in his name live in sin under another man's roof. The lawyer will explain it." Prescott. The lean man in the good coat cleared his throat and unfolded his sealed paper. "Miss Hayes," Prescott said in the smooth voice of a man paid to make ugly things sound reasonable, "you entered into a binding contract of marriage with my client executed by the Boston Matrimonial Agency of Whitfield and Sons dated the 3rd of September. Under that contract, you accepted my client's offer and his provision. A woman cannot accept a man's provision and then reside with his rival. It's a matter of law and a matter of decency. My client is prepared to be generous. He'll take you back to his household, restore your good name, and no more will be said of this unfortunate interlude." Ethan made a sound low in his throat, and the rifle came up another inch, and Charlotte's fingers pressed hard. "May I see the contract?" she said. Prescott hesitated. "The contract, Mr. Prescott. You've waved it about. Let me read it. I'm told I read very well." Reluctantly, the lawyer nudged his horse forward and held out the paper. Charlotte took it. She read it unhurried in the cold while 5 people watched her, and the longer she read, the more still she became. And Ethan, who had learned to read her stillnesses, felt his stomach sink, because her stillness meant she'd found something. "This is a fine document," Charlotte said at last. "Whitfield and Sons do good work. It's got seals and clauses and a great deal of very serious language. She looked up. It's also missing something. It's missing nothing, Prescott said. It's a complete and binding. It's missing my signature. Silence. Charlotte turned the paper around and held it up so all of them could see the line at the bottom. Victor's signature bold and black, and beside it a blank space where hers should have been. I never signed it, she said. I couldn't. The agency sends the contract with the man's signature already on it, and the bride signs upon safe arrival and acceptance upon the marriage taking place. That's how it's done, Mr. Prescott, and you know it's how it's done, because you drew papers like this before you moved west to work for men who throw women in the dirt. There was no marriage. I never signed, which means this is not a contract. She held it a moment longer. It's a proposal, and I declined it. On a public road in front of 50 witnesses, when the gentleman informed me I was, and I quote him exactly, not the woman he paid for. A flush crawled up Victor's neck. The sheriff, Prescott began, will attest. The sheriff, Charlotte said, turning to the badged man who had gone very quiet in his saddle, will attest to what he saw with his own eyes, or he'll perjure himself. And a perjuring sheriff is a sheriff who can be removed by the territorial governor, to whom I have already written a letter describing certain irregularities in this county's tax assessments. She had written no such letter. She would write it that afternoon. She stared the sheriff down. Sheriff Dunn, did you or did you not personally witness Victor Harlan reject this woman in front of the whole valley on the day she arrived? Sheriff Dunn looked at Charlotte. He looked at Victor. He looked at the rifle in Ethan's hands and the woman who wasn't afraid of any of them, and Charlotte watched a slow, careful calculation move behind his eyes. The calculation of a man who has been in a rich man's pocket a long time and has just felt the pocket start to tear. I did see it, Dunn said heavily. Whole town saw it. Ain't no use pretending different, Victor. There weren't no marriage. Girl's right about the signature. I can't arrest a woman for living where she likes when there's no contract to break. He shifted in his saddle, and for the first time in 10 years, he did not quite meet Victor Harlan's eye. You want to take that up with the territorial court, you're welcome. But I ain't dragging her off this porch. Not over a paper with a blank line on it. Not in front of witnesses. It was the first crack. Charlotte saw it and filed it away. The Sheriff Victor's own creature had just chosen his own skin over his master's pride. The wall of Victor Harlan's power was not one solid stone. It was many small stones, and small stones can be pried loose one at a time by someone patient enough to find the mortar. Victor's face had gone white, then red. You think you're clever, he said to Charlotte, and his voice had gone quiet and vicious, all the courtroom smoothness burned off it. You think you've read a paper and won something. You have no idea what you've walked into, girl. No idea whose valley this is. I know exactly whose valley this is, Charlotte said. It's the valley of a man who owns the water at the top of the creek and the land at the bottom and is missing only the 40 acres in the middle. That's your valley, Mr. Harlan. You've been building it for 10 years, since the spring of 1884, when you finally got your hands on the East Ridge water. She let that year land, and she watched his face when it did. Funny time, 84. A great deal happened that spring, and there for 1/2 of 1 second, Victor Harlan's composure cracked clean through, and underneath it, Charlotte saw naked animal fear. He knew that she knew, not the details. He couldn't know how much she had. But he saw in her face that the year 1884 meant something to her that it should not have meant to a stranger from Boston, and a man with a buried murder in his past does not need details to feel the ground open under him. He needs only to see that someone is holding a shovel. Victor recovered fast. He'd had 10 years' practice. But it was too late. Charlotte had seen it, and Ethan beside her had felt her hand tighten on his arm at the exact moment Victor's face changed, and Ethan Cole was no fool. He looked from Victor to Charlotte and back, and the beginning of a terrible understanding stirred in him. We're finished here, Victor said, gathering his reins. Prescott, done. We're finished. For now. He fixed his eyes on Ethan, and now the mask was fully back, cold and certain. You've got yourself a sharp woman, Cole. Enjoy her. Sharp things cut the hand that holds them in my experience. And your ranch is going to have a hard winter. Harder than you know." He turned his horse and rode out, the lawyer scrambling to follow, and Sheriff Dunn lingering one moment longer to touch his hat brim to Charlotte, an apology of a kind, or perhaps a man hedging a bet, before he too rode off down the frozen road. Ethan lowered the rifle. His hands were not quite steady. "Charlotte," he said. "What was that? The year, 1884. His face when you said it." He turned her by the shoulder, gentle but insistent. "You saw something. You know something. You've known something for weeks. I've watched you carry it. Tell me now. No more waiting. What do you know about 1884? And Charlotte Hayes looked at the man she had come to love, and she understood that the moment she had dreaded had arrived, and there was no putting it down softly, and there was no more time to build her airtight case in secret. Victor had seen her hand. The quiet way was over. She had to tell Ethan now, before Victor moved, because a man who learns the truth in the middle of a fight learns it wild. "Come inside," she said. "Sit down." And Ethan... Her voice broke just slightly. "What I'm about to tell you is going to be the hardest thing you've heard in 10 years. And I need you to promise me before I say it that you won't ride out that door with a gun. Because that's what he wants. That's exactly what he wants. Promise me you'll let me finish, and let me tell you the whole of it before you do one single thing." Ethan went very still. The kind of still that comes before a great grief when the body knows something is coming that the mind has not yet been told. "It's about James," he said. "Isn't it? And Sarah." "Sit down, Ethan. It wasn't an accident." His voice had gone hoarse. "That's what you're going to tell me. 10 years I've told myself it was cattle spooking in the dark, a thing that happens, a thing nobody could help. And you're going to tell me it wasn't." Charlotte took his hand in both of hers. "Sit down," she said one more time. "And let me tell you what a 7-year-old boy told me by the fire, and what it means, and what we're going to do about it. Together. In a courtroom. The right way. The way that ends with Victor Harlan behind bars instead of you behind a rope. Sit down, Ethan, please." And Ethan Cole sat. She told him everything. She told him about little Samuel, and the father who cried in the barn, and the thing done with a gun at night 10 years ago, and the cage of blackmail that had held Croft ever since. She told him her theory of the shots fired into the herd, not to kill, she thought, but to spook, to slow the drive, to weaken the Coles before the water hearing, and how it had gone catastrophically further than Victor had planned and killed James and Sarah, and how Victor had simply taken the accidental murder and turned it to profit, and buried the man who'd pulled the trigger under threats for a decade. Ethan listened without moving. His face over the course of it went through something Charlotte hoped never to watch a person go through again, grief cracking open along an old seam and bleeding fresh, and under the grief, a rage so total it frightened her, and under the rage at the very bottom, a terrible stillness. When she finished, he sat for a long time without speaking. "Croft," he said finally. "I know Croft. Quiet fella. Been on Harlan's payroll far back as I can remember. I've stood next to that man at the feed store, bought him a drink once years back when he looked like he needed one." His voice was flat and awful. "He killed my brother. He killed Sarah, and I bought him a drink. He didn't mean to kill them, Ethan. If I'm right, and I think I am, he was sent to fire a few shots and slow a cattle drive. He's a hired man, not a murderer by nature. And he's been dying by inches for 10 years over what he did. His own son says he cries in the barn. His son should watch his father hang. His son is 7 years old," Charlotte said sharply, "and he trusted me with a secret, and I will not repay a frightened child by getting his father hanged. Listen to me." She gripped his hand harder. "Croft is the only living witness to what Victor Harlan ordered. He is the one thread that, if we pull it right, unravels the whole thing, the murder, the stolen water, all of it. But if you ride out there with a gun, or if the law comes at Croft with a rope, he'll do what a cornered man does. He'll deny everything, or he'll run, or Victor will have him killed to close the last mouth. The only way we get Croft to talk, is if we offer him the one thing Victor never has. A way out that doesn't end in death. Immunity. Protection. A chance to get his son somewhere safe and start over clean. We don't threaten Croft, Ethan. We rescue him, same as you rescued me. Ethan looked at her, and something in his face shifted. The rage did not leave, but it found a shape, a channel, a direction that wasn't a gun. You want to save the man who killed my brother, he said slowly, to catch the man who ordered it. I want to catch the man who's been running this valley on blood and blackmail for 10 years, Charlotte said. And yes, to do it, we save a broken man who did a terrible thing under threat, and has been in hell ever since. That's the price. That's the only door that opens. I know it's a bitter one, but it's the door that ends with Victor Harlan destroyed, and you alive and free, and every other door I can see ends with you hanged for murder, and Victor mourning at your funeral in a fine black coat. Which door do you want, Ethan? Choose carefully. Because I love you too much to watch you choose the one with the rope. The word came out before she could stop it. Love. It landed in the middle of the room, and neither of them could pretend it hadn't. Ethan looked at her for a long, long moment. Say the rest of it, he said quietly. The rest of what? You've never said a soft word to me without a hard one right behind it to take the sting off. You just said you love me. Don't you dare take it back with a plan. His voice roughened. 10 years I've believed loving somebody just gives fate another target. I found James dead. I found Sarah dead. I built my whole life around the idea that the safest thing a man can do is love nothing, so I loved nothing for 10 years, and I called it wisdom. And then a woman got thrown off a wagon in front of me, and I picked up her suitcase, and I've been unlearning 10 years of that ever since. He turned her hand over in his. So say it plain. No plan behind it. Just once. Charlotte's eyes filled. I love you, she said. Plainly, no plan behind it. I came here to earn a wage and leave, and instead, I fell in love with a man who cooks eggs badly and stands in doorways. And I have been terrified of it for months, and I'm still terrified, and I love you anyway. There, it's said. She laughed, wet and shaking. And now, having said it, I would very much like to not have to bury you. So please, please choose the door without the rope. Ethan reached up and touched her face, and it was the first time he had touched her that way, and his hand was gentle for such a hard-worn hand. I'll choose your door, he said. God help me. I'll save Croft to hang Harlan, and I'll do it your way, slow and quiet and legal, because you're right, and because you love me, and because a man doesn't get given 2 loves in one life and throw the second one away over the first. His jaw tightened. But hear me, Charlotte. If your door doesn't open, if Croft won't talk, if the law won't move, if Victor slips it somehow, then I go through the other door, the one with the gun. I'll not spend the rest of my life 20 miles from the man who killed my brother, tipping my hat to him at the feed store. I'll give your way its chance, but it gets one chance. That's all I need, Charlotte said. One chance is all I've ever needed. They did not have long to plan it. Because the thing about pushing a proud man into a corner is that a proud man once cornered stops being careful, and Victor Harlan had seen the year 1884 on a woman's lips and gone home afraid and frightened. Proud men do not wait. 3 days later, the first of Ethan's cattle turned up dead. Toby found them at the far edge of the west pasture, a dozen head down in a frozen draw, and it wasn't sickness and it wasn't cold. Someone had driven them off a cut bank in the night, run them till they broke through the ice of the draw and couldn't climb out, and left them to die in the frozen water. 12 head in one night. And a note waited under a stone on the cut bank in a hand that wasn't Victor's, but was surely written at Victor's word. A hard winter, like I said. Sell me the North 40. It gets harder. Ethan read the note in the yard, and Charlotte watched his knuckles go white around it, and she watched him not reach for the rifle, and she loved him more in that moment than she'd known she could. 12 head, old Pete said grimly. He's testing you. Wants to see if you'll break, or if you'll come shooting. He wants me to come shooting, Ethan said. He wants me on his land in the dark with a gun so his tame sheriff can find my body in the morning and call it trespass. He handed the note to Charlotte. Evidence, First real evidence. He's getting careless. It's not enough, Charlotte said, reading it. It's a threat, not a confession. It doesn't tie to the murder, and it barely ties to him. We need Croft. She looked up. It's time. He's escalating. We can't wait for spring. I need to reach Croft, and I need to do it before Victor decides the safest thing is to close that last mouth for good. You're not going near Harlan's land. I'm not, Charlotte agreed. Croft's coming to me. His boy comes to my school every Sunday, Ethan. Samuel comes to me. And a father who cries in the barn over what he did is a father who'll walk through fire for the one person in this valley who's been kind to his son. She was already reaching for her shawl. Sunday's in 2 days. When Croft brings Samuel, I'll ask to speak with him, alone, and I'll offer him the door. But it did not wait for Sunday. That very night, long after the lamps were out, Charlotte woke to a sound at the kitchen window. Not a break-in, not violence, but the soft, desperate tap of a knuckle 3 times. Then a pause, then 3 times again. The sound a man makes when he is terrified of being heard, and more terrified of not being. She rose. She lit no lamp. She went to the window in her nightdress with her heart in her throat, and she pulled the curtain, and there in the dark, hollow-eyed and gray-faced, and shaking with cold, and with something worse than cold, stood a man she had never met, but knew at once. Croft. She opened the door before Ethan could wake, before anyone could wake, and she pulled him inside into the dark, warm kitchen, and the man stood there trembling, twisting his hat in his ruined hands. And when he spoke, his voice was the voice of a man who has not slept a full night in 10 years. "You're the teacher," he whispered. "The one who's kind to my Samuel. He talks about you. Says you told him." His voice cracked. "Says you told him his pa was a good man who did a bad thing. Not a bad man. A good man who did a bad thing." Tears were running down his face, silent, the practiced, silent tears of a man who's learned to cry without being heard. "Nobody said that about me in 10 years, ma'am. Nobody. Not even me, especially not me." Charlotte took his cold hands in hers. "Mr. Croft," she said softly, "I know what you did. I know what Harlan made you do, and I know it went farther than you ever meant, and I know you've been in hell ever since. And I've been waiting for you because I think you've been wanting to tell somebody the truth for 10 years, and I think you know I'm the one person in this valley who'll listen without a rope in her hand." Croft's whole body shook. "He's going to kill me," the man whispered. "Harlan. I heard him 3 days ago talking to his foreman, heard my own name. He's decided he called me a loose end. Said with that Boston woman poking around asking about 84 loose ends need cutting." He gripped her hands like a drowning man. "I got a boy, ma'am, Samuel. His ma's passed. If Harlan kills me, Samuel's got nobody. Nobody in the world. And I can't—" He broke. "I've been carrying this 10 years, and I can't carry it one more day. And I don't care about my own neck anymore. I truly don't. I'd hang glad. But I got a boy, and if I'm going to hang, I got to know somebody good's going to look after my boy." "Nobody's going to hang," Charlotte said fiercely, holding him up. "Listen to me. Listen. There's a way through this that keeps you alive and keeps Samuel safe and puts Victor Harlan where he belongs. And I've been building it for weeks, and all it's ever needed was you. You tell the truth, all of it, to a territorial judge, not this bought sheriff, about what Harlan ordered you to do in 1884, and you do it in exchange for immunity and protection. And Victor Harlan hangs or rots in a cell, and you and Samuel start over somewhere clean with your conscience finally quiet. That's the door, Mr. Croft. I've been holding it open for weeks. All you have to do is walk through it." Behind her, a floorboard creaked. Charlotte turned. Ethan stood in the bedroom doorway in the dark, and he had heard, she could see he had heard, and Croft saw him too, and went rigid with terror, because he knew whose brother he had killed. He knew exactly whose house this was, and he understood in one horrified instant that he was standing in the kitchen of the man whose life he had destroyed, confessing to the murder of that man's brother and his bride. For a long, terrible moment, nobody breathed. Croft sank to his knees on the kitchen floor. "Mr. Cole," he wept. "Mr. Cole, I never meant it. God is my witness. I only meant to fire over their heads, spook the herd. Slow you down before the water hearing. That's all he paid me for. I swear it on my boy's life, and the cattle just... They broke wrong. They ran the wrong way. And by the time I understood what was happening, your brother was under them, and that girl was under them, and I've seen it every night for 10 years. Every single night. I close my eyes and I see it. He pressed his forehead to the floorboards. I'll hang and be grateful. Just let me tell the truth first. Just let me put it right before I go. That's all I want in this world anymore. To put it right. Ethan Cole crossed the kitchen slowly. Charlotte's heart was in her mouth. This was the moment. This was the door with the gun and the door without it, and it all came down to what this grieving man did in the next 10 seconds, to the weeping man on his floor. Ethan stopped in front of Croft. He looked down at him for a long, long time. Then he crouched so they were level, and Charlotte saw that Ethan's own face was wet. "Get up," Ethan said. His voice was ragged, but it was steady. "Get up off my floor. A man who's carried what you've carried for 10 years and comes to confess it knowing it'll hang him, that's not a man who kneels. That's a man who stands." He gripped Croft's shoulder and hauled him up. "You killed my brother. You killed the woman I was going to marry. And I have wanted every day for 10 years to kill whoever did it with my own 2 hands. His voice shook. "But you didn't order it. You were a poor man with a gun and a rich man's threat behind you, and the rich man's the one who did the killing. He just used your hands to do it. So no, you're not going to hang. You're going to live, and you're going to testify, and you're going to raise that boy of yours. And when it's all over, if you can stand to, you're going to come stand at James's grave with me and Sarah's, and we're going to say the truth over them out loud, the 2 of us, because they've waited 10 years to have it said." Croft could not speak. He simply wept, and Ethan held the shoulder of the man who'd killed his brother. And Charlotte stood in her nightdress in the dark kitchen with tears streaming down her own face, and understood that she was watching something she had never seen in her life, and might never see again. A man choosing mercy in the exact place where he had every right to choose vengeance. "There's a territorial judge," Charlotte said when she could speak. "Judge Alden rides the circuit honest as they come, and he'll be in the county seat for the spring session. 6 weeks. We keep you hidden and safe. 6 weeks, Mr. Croft, and we get you and Samuel and your sworn statement in front of Judge Alden away from Sheriff Dunn, and we end this. But you have to survive 6 weeks. And Victor's already decided you're a loose end." She looked at Ethan. "He can't go back to Harlan's. Not for one more night." "Then he doesn't," Ethan said. "He stays here, him and the boy. We'll hide them in the old line cabin up the west draw where nobody goes in winter. Pete and Toby can run food up. Victor's men won't look on my own land for a man they think is still on Victor's. And Samuel—" "I'll get my boy," Croft said, finding his voice. "Tomorrow. I'll say he's gone to stay with kin. Harlan won't question a hand sending his motherless boy to family for the winter." He looked between them, this hollow man, and for the first time in 10 years, something that was almost hope moved across his ruined face. "You'd really do this? Hide me? Protect my boy? After what I did to your kin? Why?" And Ethan Cole looked at Charlotte, and then back at the man who'd killed his brother. And he said the thing that Charlotte would carry in her heart for the rest of her life. "Because a woman taught me this winter that you don't save a person by charging in with your fists up," Ethan said quietly. "You save them by holding up the lamp till they can see the ground. Somebody did it for me. Somebody did it for her. Now we're doing it for you." He picked up his hat from the table. "Come on, let's get you up the draw before light. You've got 6 weeks to live through and a truth to tell and a boy to raise. Best get started." They moved Croft that night up the frozen west draw to the old line cabin, and Charlotte watched the 2 men go out into the dark, the man who'd been wronged and the man who'd wronged him, walking side by side toward the one thing that might set them both free. She should have felt triumph. The door had opened. Croft would talk. The case was real now, alive within reach. But standing in the dark doorway, watching the lantern bob away up the draw, Charlotte felt instead a cold finger of dread trace down her spine. Because Victor Harlan had already decided Croft was a loose end. And a man who decides to cut a loose end does not wait 6 weeks. He would go looking for Croft. Soon, maybe tomorrow, maybe tonight. And when he found the man gone from his bunk, gone from his life, vanished into thin air the very night after a Boston woman spoke the year 1884, to his face, Victor Harlan would know exactly where to look. Charlotte pulled her shawl tight, and she stared up the dark draw where the lantern had disappeared, and she understood with the cold clarity that had kept her alive her whole life that they had just lit a fuse. The truth was out of its cage now. It could not be put back. And there were only 2 ways this ended, with Victor Harlan in chains, or with fire coming up that frozen road for every soul on Ethan Cole's ranch. 6 weeks. They had to keep a broken man and a motherless boy alive for 6 weeks against a man who owned the sheriff, the water, and half the valley. Charlotte Hayes went inside, and she lit the lamp, and she sat down at the table with the ledger and a clean sheet of paper, and she began in her small, precise hand to plan a war. The war did not wait for her to finish planning it. Victor Harlan found Croft's bunk empty at dawn, and by mid-morning, 3 of his riders were on the county road, stopping every wagon, asking every traveler whether they'd seen a hollow-eyed man with a boy. By noon, the story had circled the valley twice growing. As it went, Harlan's man had run off, or Harlan's man had been stolen away, or, and this was the version Victor's riders planted deliberately, because Victor understood a lie travels faster on legs than the truth does on crutches. Ethan Cole had kidnapped a Harlan hand and was holding him against his will. Charlotte heard it at the mercantile where she'd gone deliberately to listen. "They're saying Ethan's got him tied up somewhere," Widow Garrett murmured, pressing close. "Saying he means to force the man to lie in court, tell some tale against Mr. Harlan. That's the story going round. I don't believe a word of it, but I thought you ought to know what's being said." "Thank you, Mrs. Garrett," Charlotte said calmly, buying flowers she didn't need so the trip would look ordinary. "You're a good friend, and you're right not to believe it. But I'd take it kindly if you'd tell folks quiet that the woman Victor Harlan threw in the dirt is the same woman teaching their children to read, and ask them which version of a man they'd sooner trust, the one who abandons a bride or the one who took her in." She met the old woman's eyes. "Battles get won in kitchens and at church suppers before they're ever won in courtrooms, Mrs. Garrett. You've got a kitchen, and you go to church. That's an army if you want it to be." The old woman's spine straightened. "I've held my tongue once in my life," she said, "and been ashamed of it ever since. I'll not hold it twice." That was the first stone Charlotte laid, and it was the most important one, though it looked like nothing, because Victor Harlan was fighting with riders and lies, and a bought sheriff, and Charlotte Hayes was fighting with old women and church suppers and children who could suddenly read, and only one of them understood that a valley is not held by the man with the most cattle. It's held by the woman the mothers trust. By the end of that first week, the valley had quietly and visibly taken a side. Not out loud, nobody in Wyoming picks a fight with the richest man in the county out loud. But in 100 small ways, a rancher who'd have sold Victor his hay now found it was already promised elsewhere. A store clerk who'd have passed along word of Charlotte's movements now found he'd forgotten what he'd seen. The valley had watched Victor throw a good woman in the dirt, and it had watched that same woman teach their children for free all winter. And shame is patient, but it is not weak, and it had been building all season toward a reckoning. Victor felt the ground shifting and could not understand why. "He can't find purchase," Ethan said one night home late from riding his fences. 20 years he's snapped his fingers and this valley's jumped. Now he snaps and nothing happens. Man's near out of his mind with it. Pete heard he horsewhipped his own foreman yesterday for coming back empty-handed." "Good," Charlotte said, not looking up from her papers. "A frightened man makes mistakes. A furious frightened man makes big ones. We just have to be ready to catch them when he does." "How's Croft?" "Holding. Barely. 6 weeks in a line cabin's a long time for a man that's scared. But Samuel being with him, that's the thing keeping him upright. Boy reads to him at night from that primer you sent up. Croft told me last night it's the first time in 10 years he's slept without seeing the stampede." Ethan lowered himself into the chair across from her, and there was a heaviness in him. "Charlotte, I stood at that cabin door tonight and I watched a 7-year-old boy read scripture to the man who killed my brother, and I felt—" He stopped. I don't have the word for what I felt. It wasn't forgiveness. I'm not there. Might never be. But it wasn't hate anymore either. It was just sad. Sad all the way down, for all of us. For the 10 years everybody lost. Charlotte reached across the table and took his hand. "That's grief, Ethan," she said softly. "Real grief finally. The kind you couldn't feel for 10 years because you'd walled it up behind the hate. The hate was easier. Hate gives you somewhere to point. But it was never true, not all the way, and some part of you always knew it. What you're feeling now is what was under it the whole time. It's terrible, and it means you're healing. Those are the same thing more often than anybody admits." He turned her hand over in his and looked at it a while. "When this is over," he said, "if it ends the way you've planned it, Judge Alden Croft testifies Victor in chains. When it's over." He looked up. "I want to marry you. Not because of the valley talk, not to make anything proper. Because I love you. And because you walked into the saddest house in Wyoming and made it a home. And I don't want to spend one day of whatever life I've got left not being married to you. That's all. That's the whole of it." Charlotte's breath caught. "You're proposing to me," she said, "in the middle of a war over a ledger at 11 o'clock at night. Seemed like the right time. We might not get a peaceful one." She laughed, and it turned halfway to a sob, and she pressed his hand to her cheek. "Ask me again when Victor Harlan's in chains," she said. "Not because I'm not sure I've never been more sure of anything, but because I want to say yes to you as a free woman in a valley that's free of him, not as two frightened people hiding a witness in a line cabin. Give me that. Give me a yes with no fear underneath it. We've both had enough of yeses with fear underneath them to last a lifetime." "That's a better answer than yes," Ethan said quietly. "It is yes. It's yes with a date on it. The date is the day that man can't touch us anymore." They almost didn't get the date, because 8 days before the spring session, Victor Harlan finally made his big mistake, and it was bigger and crueler than anything Charlotte had planned to catch. He couldn't find Croft. His riders had scoured the county, and a proud, furious, frightened man who cannot find the loose end he needs to cut will eventually decide to cut something else instead, something that will smoke his quarry out. He came for the cattle, not 12 head this time, the whole herd. Victor's men, 6 of them masked in the last black hour before a dawn that promised the season's final blizzard, cut Ethan's fences on the east and south lines both at once, and drove the entire wintered-over herd toward the Badlands to the west, meaning to scatter them into the broken country where a storm would finish what the men started. It was the kind of loss a ranch doesn't recover from. It was meant to break Ethan Cole for good, to leave him too ruined to feed a hidden witness, to force Croft out of whatever hole he was in when the man he was sheltering with went bankrupt. Old Pete woke the house roaring. And here Victor made the true error, the one his rage blinded him to, because he thought he was attacking one lonely man with 2 hired hands and a woman. He'd forgotten what that woman had been building all winter, 1 basket of preserves and 1 child's reading lesson at a time. Charlotte was dressed and out the door in 90 seconds. She did not reach for a rifle. She reached for the ranch bell, the big iron bell Ethan's father had hung to call the hands from the far pastures, silent for 10 years, and she rang it hard over and over, a sound that carried for miles across the frozen valley in the still air before a storm. "What are you doing?" Ethan shouted, already saddling. "That'll bring every rider Victor's got." "It'll bring more than that," Charlotte said and kept ringing. "You told me once I don't do one thing at a time. Ride Ethan, save what cattle you can, take Pete and Toby. Don't you dare go near Victor's men to fight them, herd the cattle, that's all, turn them back from the Badlands before the storm. Leave Victor to me." Charlotte, ride. He rode, and Charlotte Hayes stood in the freezing dark and rang a 10-year silent bell, and one by one across the valley lamps began to light. They came because she'd taught their children. They came because Widow Garrett had spent a month in every kitchen in the valley saying that man threw a good woman in the dirt and she taught your babies to read anyhow. They came because shame had been building in that valley all winter, and here finally was a way to set it down. They came on horseback, and in wagons, ranchers and farmhands and grown sons a dozen, then 2 dozen, then more the same people who had stood silent the day Charlotte arrived, riding now through the dark toward the sound of her bell. By the time the first gray light broke under the gathering storm, 30 men and half again as many women were on Ethan Cole's land, and the herd that Victor's 6 masked riders had scattered toward the Badlands was being turned bunched, driven back to shelter by a whole valley's worth of neighbors who had decided all at once, and without a word of discussion, whose side they were on. Victor's men, outnumbered 5 to 1, broke and ran. One of them didn't run fast enough. Toby, 19-year-old Toby, who couldn't read his own name 6 months ago and now carried a primer in his saddlebag, ran a masked rider down in the open and dragged him off his horse. And when they pulled the man's mask off in the gray dawn light, half the valley recognized him. It was one of Harlan's regular hands, a man named Deacons, and he was caught red-handed on Ethan Cole's land with fence cutters still in his coat and 30 witnesses standing around him. The lie died right there in the snow. Ethan Cole kidnapped a Harlan hand. Nobody in the valley would ever believe it again, not with Harlan's own man caught cutting Cole fences in front of half the county. But Charlotte was not there to see Deacons caught, because while 30 neighbors turned the herd, Charlotte had done the coldest, bravest thing of her life. She had understood something the moment the bell started ringing, that Victor Harlan, wherever he was directing this from, would come to see his triumph. A man who plans the public humiliation of a bride to teach a valley a lesson does not order the destruction of his enemy from his parlor. He comes to watch. He needs to watch. And so Charlotte had saddled her own horse, and while the valley converged on the cattle, she had ridden the other way toward the high ground above the east pasture, the one rise from which a man could sit his horse and watch a ranch be destroyed. Victor Harlan was exactly where she knew he'd be. He heard her horse and turned, and his face when he saw her, not Ethan, not the sheriff, not a posse, but the Boston woman alone riding up the rise toward him through the first spitting snow of the blizzard, was a thing she would remember all her days. He'd braced for everything but her. "You," he said. "Me." Charlotte drew rein a dozen feet from him. The wind was rising. Below them, faint through the snow, came the ring of the bell and the ball of cattle being turned and the shouts of a valley full of men who had chosen. "It's not working, is it, Mr. Harlan? Listen to that. That's the sound of your plan failing. Those are 30 of your neighbors turning the herd you scattered. Your men are running. One of them's caught. And you're up here alone in the snow, watching it all come apart, and you can't understand, how can you? How a lonely man and a beggar in a good dress beat you. You have no idea what I can do," Victor said, and his voice was low and shaking with a rage past all reason now. "I can burn you out. I can have your witness. Yes, I know you've got Croft. I've known for a week you think I'm a fool. I can have him found dead in a ditch and that boy of his in an orphan train before your judge ever rides into this county. I still hold every card that matters. The sheriff, the court, the money. You've won a night, girl. You have not won the war." "Croft's already given a sworn statement," Charlotte said. It was a bluff. Croft's statement wasn't due to be taken until Judge Alden arrived, but she watched it land, watched Victor's certainty crack, and she pressed into the crack the way her father had taught her to press before he forgot his own lessons. "Written down," she went on calm as ice. "Witnessed, sealed. Sent by a rider you'll never trace to a man you'll never reach to be opened by the territorial governor if anything happens to Croft, or to the boy, or to me, or to Ethan Cole. Everything, Mr. Harlan. 1884. The shots fired into the herd. Your order. James Cole. Sarah. All of it in Croft's own hand, sitting somewhere you'll never find it primed to hang you the moment you touch one hair on any of us." She let the snow fall between them. "You didn't just steal water 10 years ago. You killed 2 people to get it, and then you spent a decade blackmailing the man who pulled the trigger, and now that man has told the truth, and there is no amount of money on earth that buys it back. It's out. It's out, and it can't go back in. You lost the war a week ago, and you're only finding out now." Victor Harlan stared at her through the driving snow. And then he did the thing that proved beyond any statement Croft could give exactly what kind of man he was. He went for his gun. He'd have shot her. Charlotte saw it clear, saw his hand drop to the pistol at his hip, saw the decision arrive in his eyes that if it was all coming down, then he'd at least take the woman who'd brought it down with him, and there was nothing between Charlotte Hayes and the end of her life but the 12 feet of snow and the half-second it takes a furious man to clear leather. The shot cracked across the rise. But it wasn't Victor's. Victor Harlan jerked, and his pistol fell from his hand into the snow, and he clutched his shoulder and stared past Charlotte down the slope with an expression of pure disbelief. Charlotte turned. Croft stood 20 yards down the rise, a rifle at his shoulder, snow gathering on his hat. He had come down from the line cabin when he heard the bell had left. The safety Charlotte had built for him walked straight toward the one man in the world who wanted him dead because he'd seen from the high cabin a lone woman ride up the rise toward Victor Harlan, and he had understood before Charlotte did what Victor would do when cornered. The man who'd killed with a gun 10 years ago had just saved a life with one. "That's the last thing I'll ever do with a rifle," Croft said, lowering it, his voice carrying flat and final across the snow. He was weeping, the way he wept silent. 10 years ago I fired into the dark and killed 2 innocent people, and I've wanted to die every day since. Today I fired at the man who made me do it to save a good woman's life. And now I'm done. I'm done with guns, and I'm done with running, and I'm done with being Victor Harlan's dog. He looked at Victor bleeding in the snow. "I'll tell the judge everything, Victor. Everything. And you can't threaten me anymore, because the worst thing you ever held over me, that I'd hang and leave my boy alone, these people already promised to look after my boy. So there's nothing left you can take. You spent 10 years thinking you owned me. You never owned anything but a scared man, and scared men run out." Victor Harlan sank to his knees in the snow, clutching his shoulder, and for the first time in 20 years, the richest man in the valley had nothing to say. It was over. Not the courtroom, not the sentencing. Those would come in their season, but the war itself. The true contest of it ended there on a snowy rise, with a wounded tyrant on his knees, and a broken man lowering a rifle, and a schoolteacher from Boston, sitting her horse unharmed, having beaten Victor Harlan with a bell and a winter of kindness. They brought him down off the rise. The blizzard broke over the valley within the hour, but the herd was already turned and sheltered, saved by 30 neighbors, and Deacons was already caught with the fence cutters in his coat, and now Victor Harlan himself came down in a wagon with a rifle wound in his shoulder, and 30 witnesses to what he'd ordered done. Even Sheriff Dunn, when he arrived, could read which way the wind had finally turned. He took Deacons into custody. He took Victor's statement, or tried to, and got only silence. And when Charlotte quietly informed him that Judge Alden would be reviewing the county's tax records and its sheriff's conduct alongside the murder case, Dunn made the last calculation of his crooked career and decided loudly and for the record that he had always suspected Victor Harlan and was glad to see justice done. Nobody believed him. But it didn't matter. The stones of Victor's power were coming loose all at once now, each frightened man scrambling to be on the right side before the reckoning. And that scramble was itself the surest sign that the reckoning had come. Judge Alden rode into the county seat 6 days later. What followed was not a battle, but an unraveling. Croft testified steady, quiet weeping only once when he described the sound the cattle made. Samuel was kept far from the courtroom, safe with Widow Garrett, but the boy's earlier words and the testimony of the schoolteacher he'd trusted them to formed part of the record. Deacons facing prison for the fence cutting traded everything he knew for leniency, and it turned out he knew a great deal. Years of Victor's schemes, the forged tax notices, the pressure on the Sorensens and the Millers to sell the whole slow machinery of a man building a kingdom on other people's ruin, and Charlotte Hayes produced the ledger, not Ethan's ledger, her own. All winter in her small, precise hand, she had been building it, every offer Victor made for the North 40, every date, every forged tax notice, every purchase that tightened the fence of land around Ethan's ranch. Every dead cow and every threatening note cross-referenced and sourced and laid out with the pitiless clarity of a woman who had watched her own father destroyed for want of exactly this. She laid it before Judge Alden, like a proof before a slow class patiently. In order, each fact resting on the one before, and when she was done, there was not a soul in that courtroom who did not understand precisely what Victor Harlan had done, and precisely how. The court found for the truth. Victor Harlan was held for the murders of James Cole and Sarah Whitman, for though he'd never fired the shots he had ordered them, and the law, when Judge Alden explained it, made no distinction between the hand that pulls the trigger and the will that commands it. The stolen East Ridge water was ordered, returned to review the fraudulent purchases of the Miller and Sorensen places, set aside for the courts to untangle, and the bulk of Victor Harlan's kingdom, the kingdom he'd murdered and blackmailed and schemed 10 years to build, was stripped from him piece by piece to be returned where it could be returned and sold for restitution where it couldn't. The richest man in the valley left the county seat in shackles, and Croft, who had walked into a courtroom expecting a rope, was granted his immunity for his testimony and walked out a free man with his son's hand in his, into a valley that had learned that hard winter the difference between a bad man and a good man who'd done a bad thing under a rich man's thumb. Charlotte found Ethan on the courthouse steps afterward. He was standing very still, hat in his hands, looking at nothing, and she knew that look. It was the look of a man who has carried a weight 10 years and just felt it lifted and doesn't yet know how to stand without it. "It's over," she said softly. "It's over," he agreed. His voice was rough. 10 years. I built my whole life around a wall of hate, and it came down in 6 days, and I don't know who I am on the other side of it yet. "You're the man who chose mercy over a rope," Charlotte said. "You're the man who held up a lamp for the person who wronged him worst in this world. You're the man who saved his brother's memory not with a gun, but with the truth in a court in the light." She took his hand. "That's who you are on the other side of it, Ethan. The same man you always were underneath. You just don't have to carry the wall anymore." Ethan looked down at her hand in his. "You did this," he said. "All of it. The valley, the Ledger Croft Judge Alden. You walked off a wagon 4 months ago with 70 cents and a broken suitcase, and you tore down a kingdom that took a man 10 years to build, and you did it without firing a shot yourself, and you did it while teaching children to read." He shook his head, and there was wonder in it, and something close to reverence. "I picked up your suitcase that day because I thought you were somebody who needed saving. And every day since I've understood a little more that I had it exactly backwards." Charlotte's eyes filled. "You didn't rescue me because I was helpless, Ethan," she said. "You respected me because I was strong. It just took us both a whole winter to see it plain." And there on the courthouse steps in the thin, cold sunlight of a Wyoming spring, with Victor Harlan in chains behind them, and a whole valley coming down the road toward home, Ethan Cole set down the last of the weight he'd carried for 10 years. "Charlotte Hayes," he said, "the man can't touch us anymore, so I'm asking you again, and this time, there's no fear underneath it. None, not 1 ounce." He held both her hands in his. "Marry me. Not to make anything proper. Not because the valley talks. Because I love you, and because you're the strongest, sharpest, kindest soul I've ever known, and because I want to spend every day I've got left standing beside you instead of watching you from a doorway." Charlotte Hayes looked at the man who had picked up her suitcase. And this time, there was no wall behind her answer, and no plan underneath it, and no fear anywhere in it at all. "Ask me on the ranch," Charlotte said. Ethan blinked. It was not the yes he'd braced for, nor the no he'd feared. "How's that? You asked me here on courthouse steps with Victor being loaded into a prison wagon 40 feet behind us." She squeezed his hands, and there were tears standing in her eyes, but there was laughter under them too, the first free laughter she'd felt in longer than she could remember. "Ethan Cole, I have said 2 of the most important yeses of my life in the wrong places. I said yes to a man's promise in a Boston parlor, and it threw me in the dirt. I nearly said yes to you at a kitchen table at 11 o'clock at night in the middle of a war. I'm done saying important things in the wrong places." She wiped her eyes with the back of her wrist. "Take me home. Ask me standing on the ground we saved with no chains in the picture and no fear in the air, and I will give you an answer that neither of us will ever have to wonder about." Ethan looked at her a long moment. Then slowly a smile spread across his weathered face, a real one, the kind she'd only seen a handful of times all winter, the kind that took 10 years off him. "You are," he said, "the most particular woman God ever made. I've been told. Now stop wasting daylight and take me home." They rode back into the valley together, and the valley came out to meet them. It was not planned. Nobody organized it. But word had run ahead of them the way word does, and as their wagon came up the county road toward Ethan's ranch, people were simply there, standing at their gates, waiting at the crossroads, lining the last stretch of road home. The same people who had stood silent the day Charlotte arrived. Widow Garrett was there, and the blacksmith who'd studied his hands that first afternoon, and old Mrs. Pruitt who'd scolded Ethan for taking in a stranger, and 30 ranchers who'd turned a herd in a blizzard, and their wives and their children. All the children Charlotte had taught to read waving primers over their heads like little flags. Charlotte looked at them, and her throat closed. "They came out for you," Ethan said quietly. "They came out for both of us." "No." He shook his head. "The day you arrived, this same road was lined with these same people, and every one of them looked at their shoes. Today they're looking at you." He drew the wagon to a slow walk so it would last. "That's not the same valley you rode into Charlotte. You changed it. One reading lesson at a time all winter, you turned a town full of cowards into a town full of neighbors, and they know it. Every soul on this road knows exactly who did that." And then from somewhere in the crowd a voice called out. Old Mrs. Pruitt's voice cracked and clear. "We're sorry, Miss Hayes," the old woman cried. "We're sorry we stood by. We won't none of us ever stand by again long as we live." And the road erupted, not in cheering exactly, but in something better. A rough chorus of voices, men's and women's, both calling out the same thing in a dozen different ways. A whole valley apologizing at once for the silence of one autumn afternoon, and meaning it. And Charlotte Hayes sat on the wagon seat with her hand pressed to her mouth and let herself for the first time, since she'd stepped off that train, be welcomed. They reached the ranch at dusk. Croft was there with Samuel. Both of them freed now. Both of them staying on, for Ethan had offered Croft honest work and an honest wage the day the judge set him loose. And Croft, who had expected a rope and received a home, had wept and said yes, and meant it, more than he'd ever meant anything. Toby was there, and old Pete, who took one look at Charlotte's face and Ethan's, and knew in his silent way exactly what had not yet been said and was about to be. Ethan helped Charlotte down from the wagon. He walked her out past the house, past the barn, to the low rise at the edge of the yard, where you could see the whole spread laid out the ranch that wasn't much, the ranch they'd saved, the ranch a whole valley had ridden through a blizzard to protect. He took off his hat. "All right," he said. "We're standing on the ground we saved. There's no chains in the picture. There's no fear in the air. The man can't touch us, and he never will again." He took both her hands. "Charlotte Hayes, I picked up your suitcase on the worst day of your life because I couldn't stand to watch a person carry that much alone. I didn't know that day that I was picking up the rest of my life. But I was. Every day since you've been the reason I get up in the morning, and the reason the saddest house in Wyoming has laughter in it again. I love you more than I've got words for, and I've been saving words up for 10 years, so that's saying something. Marry me, here, on this ground, for no reason but that I can't imagine one more day without you." And Charlotte Hayes, standing on the ground she'd saved, with the sun going down over a valley that had finally learned her worth, gave him the answer that neither of them would ever have to wonder about. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Ethan. With my whole heart, and no fear anywhere in it, yes." He kissed her then for the first time, and behind them from the yard came a whoop that could only have been Toby, and a single sharp clap that could only have been old Pete, and somewhere a 7-year-old boy laughing, and Charlotte Hayes understood that she had at long last arrived. But there was one thing left to do before the wedding, and it was Ethan who asked for it. 2 days later, on a still gray morning, Ethan and Croft walked out together to the far corner of the ranch where 2 graves stood side by side under a lone cottonwood. James Cole, 22 years old, and Sarah Whitman, who had wanted to be a teacher and never got the chance. They had made the promise weeks ago, in a dark kitchen. That when it was over, if Croft could stand to, they would say the truth over these graves out loud, the two of them, because James and Sarah had waited 10 years to have it said. Charlotte watched them go from the porch, and she did not follow. Some things a man has to do without a woman holding up the lamp. She could not hear the words. But she watched Ethan Cole stand at his brother's grave with the man who had killed him. And she watched Croft's shoulders shake. And she watched Ethan, after a long, long time, reach out and put his hand on Croft's shoulder, the same shoulder he'd gripped in the kitchen that first terrible night. And she understood that whatever was being said over those graves, it was the thing that finally let two broken men set down a weight they'd carried for 10 years apiece. When they came back, both their faces were wet, and neither of them was ashamed of it. And Croft looked 10 years younger, and Ethan looked for the first time since she'd known him like a man at peace. "What did you say to them?" Charlotte asked Ethan that night gently. "You don't have to tell me. I told James I'd finally figured out how to honor him," Ethan said. "Not with a gun, not with hate. 10 years I thought honoring him meant hating the man who took him. Turns out it meant living well, building something good, marrying a woman he'd have liked, and he'd have liked you, Charlotte. He'd have liked you enormous. James always did prefer folks who wouldn't take any nonsense off him." He smiled faintly. "And I told Sarah that the school she wanted to build is built. That there's children reading in my house every Sunday because of a woman who came along 10 years after her and finished the thing she started. I told her it wasn't the same as her getting to do it. But it wasn't nothing either. It was a good thing standing where her good thing should have stood. I hoped she'd take some comfort in it." Charlotte's eyes filled. "She would," she whispered. "I never met her, and I know she would." They were married that spring in a simple ceremony in the yard of the ranch that wasn't much, and the entire valley came. Not the way a valley comes to a rich man's wedding out of obligation and appetite. They came the way people come to something they helped make. Widow Garrett made the cake. The children Charlotte had taught sang a song they'd practiced in secret for weeks, and got half the words wrong, and it was the most beautiful thing anyone there had ever heard. Old Pete gave Charlotte away, because when Ethan had asked him to, the old man had gone so quiet and worked his jaw so hard that everyone understood it was the greatest honor of his life. Toby cried openly and didn't care who saw. Croft stood at the back with Samuel's hand in his, a free man at a wedding he'd helped make possible. And when Charlotte caught his eye across the yard, she smiled at him, and he smiled back. And it was the smile of a man who had finally been allowed to put a terrible thing down. There was no talk of Victor Harlan that day. There didn't need to be. He was gone, tried, convicted, sent away to serve out the years the law had given him. His kingdom, broken up and parceled back to the valley he'd stolen it from. The East Ridge water ran free again. The Miller place and the Sorensen place went back to families who'd farmed them honest. And the name Victor Harlan, which had ruled that valley by fear for 20 years, began already to fade into the kind of story parents tell as a warning rather than a name anyone still trembled at. But Charlotte and Ethan were not finished. In fact, in the deepest sense, they were only beginning, because Charlotte had not crossed a continent, been thrown in the dirt, and torn down a kingdom, only to settle quietly into being a rancher's wife. That was never going to be enough for her, and Ethan, who loved exactly the thing in her that would never settle for enough, would not have wanted it to be. "I've been thinking," she said one evening a few weeks after the wedding, in the tone Ethan had come to recognize meant the ranch was about to change. "I've noticed," he said. "You've had that look. The one you get before you turn my whole life upside down. What is it this time?" "The house Victor built me," Charlotte said. "The one I never lived in. It's part of what the court parceled back. It's sitting empty, a big, fine house, the house he meant to lock a stranger away in, so no one would ask questions." She set down her sewing. "I want it, Ethan, not to live in. We've got a home. I want to turn it into something." "Into what?" "Into the thing I needed and didn't have the day I stepped off that wagon." Her voice was quiet and fierce. "There are women all over this frontier in the fix I was in. Widows with no menfolk and no money. Wives who ran from men worse than Victor. Girls who came west on a promise like I did and got thrown in the dirt like I did with no cowboy decent enough to pick up their suitcase. Right now, when that happens, There's nothing. There's a stage back to Cheyenne and 70 cents, and God help you. I want there to be something. A house. A place a woman alone on this frontier can come to and be safe and be fed and be taught a trade and help to stand on her own feet. No charity, no strings, no man deciding her future for her. A place where the answer to a decent woman shouldn't have to face the frontier alone isn't one lucky stranger with a wagon. It's a door that's always open. Ethan was quiet for a long moment. You want to take the house that man built to trap you, he said slowly, and turn it into the exact opposite of everything he was. Yes? You want to spend the rest of your life making sure no woman ever stands alone in the dirt in this valley again the way you stood. Yes. Ethan Cole looked at his wife, and his eyes were bright, and when he spoke, his voice was thick. Sarah wanted to teach children, he said. And you finished that. Now you want to build a place for women who've got nobody. He shook his head slowly. I spent 10 years believing that loving somebody just gives fate another target to aim at. That the safe thing was to love nothing and build nothing and keep my head down and my heart shut. And here you are, a woman who got hit by fate as hard as anybody I ever knew, and your answer to it isn't to shut your heart. It's to build a door that never closes. He took her hand. How did I ever think keeping my heart shut was the wise thing? You're the bravest person I've ever met, and the bravest thing about you isn't that you tore down Victor Harlan. It's that after everything you still believe in kindness enough to build a house out of it. Then you'll help me. Charlotte, he said, I'll spend the rest of my life helping you. That was rather the point of the wedding. And so they built it. They called it in the end simply the Welcome House, because Charlotte would have no grand name and no plaque and no reminder anywhere on it of the man who'd built the walls. And the door was always open. Over the years that followed, a great many women came through it, some for a night, some for a season, some who stayed for good, and became part of the strange, warm, ever-growing family that gathered around Ethan and Charlotte Cole. Widows came and were taught to keep books and run stock, so no man could ever cheat them. Runaway wives came and were given time and safety, and when they were ready, helped to start again. Girls thrown off wagons by men who'd promised them the world came, and found that this time in this valley, there was somewhere to go. Charlotte taught them all what her father had taught her before he forgot it, that a woman who can read a ledger can never be lied to about money. And money is the lie men tell women most often. She taught them their letters, and their sums, and their own worth, and she watched year after year women who'd arrived at that door with nothing walk back out of it standing straight, unafraid, free. And the children never stopped coming Sundays to read. Croft raised Samuel on the ranch, and the boy grew into a steady, quiet, good young man. And when he was grown, he told Charlotte once that the thing that had saved his father's life was not the rifle on the rise, and not even the judge's mercy. It was a schoolteacher who'd told a frightened 7-year-old that his pa was a good man who'd done a bad thing and not a bad man because that one sentence had given a broken boy a father worth loving and a broken man a self worth saving. You gave me my pa back before you ever met him, Samuel said. You did it with one sentence by a fire when I was 7. And Charlotte, who had said that sentence almost without thinking, understood then that the smallest kindnesses are so often the ones that turn a whole life. Ethan Cole lived out his years a man at peace. The wall of hate he'd built around himself for a decade came down and never went back up, and in its place grew something. He'd stopped believing he'd ever have a full house, a valley full of friends, a wife he never once stopped watching from doorways. Though now he watched her, the way a man watches the thing. He can't believe he was lucky enough to keep. He never became a rich man. He never wanted to. The biggest ranch in the valley had belonged to Victor Harlan, and everyone had seen where that led. Ethan and Charlotte built something else instead, not the biggest, but the warmest, the one every traveler in trouble learned to point toward, the one where the door was always open and the coffee was always on. Years later, when they'd both gone gray, a young woman came through the county on a stage, a mail-order bride, as it happened, traveling toward a man she'd never met, frightened half to death. And at the way station, she heard two old-timers talking, and she asked them timid whether it was a safe valley for a woman alone, whether there was anyone decent in it. And one of the old men laughed not unkindly and told her a story. He told her that 30 years back, the richest man in the valley had sent to Boston for a bride and thrown her in the dirt in front of the whole town when she arrived. And that a quiet cowboy nobody had ever thought much of had picked up her suitcase and said a decent woman shouldn't have to face the frontier alone. And that the rich man had turned out to be a murderer and a thief, and the quiet cowboy and the thrown-away bride had brought him down together and married and built a house where any woman in trouble could always find a door open. "So you needn't be scared, miss," the old-timer said. "You've come to the right valley for a woman alone. It's the safest one in the territory. And you can thank a lady named Charlotte Cole for that, her and a cowboy named Ethan, who knew when nobody else in this whole valley knew it, that you don't measure a man by what he claims. You measure him by what he protects." Because in the end, that was the truth. They left behind them written not in a letter, but in 30 years of everyday kindness, in a door that never closed, and a lamp always held up for the next lost soul on the road. A soulmate is not the person who claims you. It is the one who respects your dignity, protects your freedom, and stands beside you, never in front of you, never above you, while you become the person you were always meant to be. Victor Harlan tried to own a woman and a valley and the water itself, and he died with nothing and no one wept. Ethan Cole picked up a suitcase in the dirt, asked nothing, claimed nothing, and gave a frightened stranger the freedom to choose. And in choosing him, she gave him back a life he'd thrown away for grief. That is what love is. Not a promise written in a letter. Not a contract with a name signed at the bottom. It is a hand reaching down into the dirt to lift you up. And then this is the whole of it. This is everything it is. That same hand letting go, so that when you stand, because you chose to free and unafraid, and finally, wholly yourself.